There's a specific kind of silence that only exists inside a parked car at 2 in the morning. It's not peaceful. It's not quiet the way a bedroom is quiet, or the way a library asks you to be quiet. It's the silence of a man who has run out of places to go and is only just beginning to understand what that means. My name is Thomas Hadley. Most people call me Tom. I'm 62 years old. I have a bad left knee that predicts rain better than any meteorologist in Tennessee. And 3 weeks ago, I was the owner of Hadley Construction, one of the most respected mid-size contracting firms in Nashville. We built schools. We built community centers. We built the kind of things that have a plaque on the wall and a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a mayor shaking someone's hand in a photograph. I am telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you this so you understand exactly how far a man can fall and how fast. It started with Route 9. For those of you who don't know Nashville, Route 9 cuts through the eastern edge of the city, past the kind of neighborhoods that are just starting to gentrify, past the warehouses and the auto shops and the spots that haven't decided yet what they want to be. We had a contract out there. Mixed-use development, 12 stories, retail on the ground floor, apartments above. It was the biggest project Hadley Construction had ever taken on, and I was proud of it the way you're proud of something you've worked your whole life to deserve. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in September. A structural failure on the 4th floor. One worker was killed. His name was Danny Reeves. He was 38 years old. He had a wife and a 19-year-old son, and he went to work that morning the same way he had gone to work every morning for the past 4 years. Which is to say, he went to work, trusting that the place he was going was safe. I found out at 6:47 in the morning. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, and my phone rang, and the floor of my life just disappeared from under my feet. Not the floor of my kitchen. I want to be clear about that. The actual floor was fine, but the other kind of floor, the invisible one that you spend your whole life building out of hard work and good decisions and quiet faith that things will mostly be okay, that floor was gone. Just like that. Just like Danny Reeves. The investigation started immediately. OSHA was on site by noon. My lawyers were on the phone by 1, and somewhere between the second and third call from my insurance company, I began to get the sense that something was not right. Not wrong in the way that accidents are wrong. Wrong in a different way. A colder way. The kind of wrong that has a shape to it, that has corners and edges, and the distinct feeling of intention. But I didn't have time to think about that yet, because the consequences were already moving faster than my thoughts. The lawsuits came first. 3 of them, filed within a week. My insurance carrier began making noises about coverage gaps that I had never been told existed. The city suspended our operating license pending investigation, which meant every other project we had in motion came to a sudden stop. Contracts that had nothing to do with Route 9 began to fall apart because nobody wants to work with a company under federal scrutiny. And I understood that. I did, but understanding something doesn't make it hurt less. By the end of the 3rd week, Hadley Construction was finished. Not struggling. Not in trouble. Finished. The bank moved faster than I thought banks were legally allowed to move. My business accounts were frozen while the civil suits were pending. My personal accounts followed shortly after, tied up in a financial web that my lawyer explained to me twice and that I still didn't fully understand, which I suspect was the point. And the house I had lived in for 19 years. The house where Margaret had planted roses along the back fence the spring we moved in. The house where I had stood at the kitchen window 10,000 mornings drinking coffee and watching the light come through the trees. That house was gone too. I want to tell you something about losing a house. People talk about it like it's a financial event. And it is. But it's also something else. When you walk through those rooms for the last time, when you stand in the doorway of a bedroom that still smells faintly like the person you lost 2 years ago, when you look at the slightly crooked mail slot by the front door that you always said you'd fix and never did, it's not a financial event. It's a kind of grief that doesn't have a name yet. I packed what I could fit into the back of my truck. I left what I couldn't. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror because I knew if I looked I would stop. And if I stopped, I might not start again. On the dashboard, tucked into the corner where the windshield meets the frame, there was a photograph, small, wallet-sized, slightly faded at the edges. Margaret and me at the Grand Ole Opry, 1998. She was laughing at something I had said. I couldn't remember what it was anymore. I had spent 2 years trying to remember, and it was gone. The way so many things were gone now. I drove for a while without a destination. And then, because there was only one place left, I pointed the truck north toward a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Franklin, Tennessee, where my son Connor lived in a colonial house with green shutters and a 2-car garage, and a life that I had helped him build. I wasn't asking for much. A couch. A week. Maybe 2. Enough time to think straight. To breathe. To figure out what a 62-year-old man with a bad knee, and no company, and no house does next. I pulled onto his street at 10:45 at night. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that costs money. The lawns were trimmed. The driveways were clean. The houses had that look of people who had arranged their lives carefully and were serious about maintaining the arrangement. I sat in the truck for a few minutes before getting out. I looked at the lit window on the second floor. The warm rectangle of yellow light that meant someone was still awake. I looked at the front door with its brass knocker that I had helped Connor pick out at the hardware store 2 Christmases ago. Then I got out of the truck, walked up the front path and knocked. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself that whatever else had happened, whatever else had fallen apart, this was my son. This was the boy I had coached in Little League for 6 straight summers. This was the young man whose college tuition I had worked double contracts to pay. This was Connor. The porch light came on. The door opened, and my son looked at me across the threshold with an expression I had never seen on his face before, and hoped to never see again. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't concern. It was something closer to the look you get when you see an accident on the highway. You feel bad, but you really wish you hadn't seen it. Dad. Connor said my name, the way you say a word you weren't expecting to have to use. Quietly, carefully. Like he was hoping if he kept his voice low enough, the situation might stay manageable. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and the kind of sweatpants that cost more than they have any business costing. His hair was slightly disheveled from what I assumed was the couch, not the bed, which meant he had been watching something and fallen asleep, which meant this was a normal Tuesday night for him. Normal Tuesday nights were something I had not had in 3 weeks. Connor, I said, I need a place to stay. Just for a little while. He stepped slightly outside the door. Not all the way out. Just enough to pull it mostly closed behind him, leaving a gap of warm light and the faint sound of a television still running somewhere inside. It was such a small gesture, such a careful, practiced-looking small gesture. I wondered, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, how long he had been rehearsing it. Dad. I heard what happened. He kept his voice low. I'm really sorry. I am. But this isn't a great time. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at the door he was mostly blocking. I thought about the brass knocker we had picked out together 2 Christmases ago, which was now on the other side of that door where I couldn't see it anymore. Connor, I said. It's Tuesday. He winced. It was a real wince. Not a performed one. Whatever he was feeling in that moment, it was genuine. I'll give him that. I know it is. It's just, Rebecca isn't really comfortable with. And we have the kids. And with everything going on right now, it's just not the right. It's just not a great time. I want to tell you something about that sentence. About the word comfortable. About the idea that the relevant consideration in this moment was whether Rebecca was comfortable. I had paid for 2 years of Connor's college tuition by working back-to-back contracts through the winters. I had put $20,000 toward the down payment on this house with the brass knocker and the green shutters and the couch where Connor had been comfortably asleep 20 minutes ago. I had sat in the front row at his wedding and looked at his face when Rebecca walked down the aisle and thought, "This is what all of it was for. This is why you work the way you've worked." I didn't say any of that. "Okay," I said instead. And Connor, my son, the boy I had coached through 6 summers of Little League and 3 years of a business degree and one very bad breakup in 2012, looked down at his shoes and said, "I'm sorry, Dad," in a voice that told me he meant it, which somehow made it worse. And then he closed the door. The porch light stayed on for about 30 seconds. Then it went off too. I stood there in the dark for a moment. Just stood there. The way you stand when your body hasn't yet received the message that it's time to move. The neighborhood was so quiet I could hear the distant bark of a dog 2 streets over. I could hear the wind moving through the oak trees at the end of the block. Normal sounds. Ordinary. Tuesday night sounds. Nothing about this was an ordinary Tuesday night. I walked back to my truck. I sat down in the driver's seat. I closed the door. I looked at the steering wheel for what felt like a long time, but was probably 45 seconds. And then something happened that surprised me, which was that I laughed. Not a happy laugh. Not the kind of laugh that means things are funny. It was the laugh that comes out of a man when he has reached the outer edge of what he can process, and his body just decides to do something with all of it. And what it decided to do was laugh. High and slightly unhinged and completely involuntary. The kind of laugh that would have concerned me if I'd heard it coming from someone else. I reclined the seat as far as it would go. I pulled my jacket off and spread it across my chest like a blanket. I looked up at the ceiling of the truck cab, which had a small scuff mark in the fabric near the dome light that I had never noticed before and now found oddly comforting. Something familiar, something that had not changed. I want to say something about the seats in that truck. They were not designed for sleeping. Whoever engineered the lumbar support in that vehicle had clearly never had a night like this one. And I would like to believe that if they had, they would have made different choices. But you work with what you have. And what I had was a reclined seat, a jacket that was not quite wide enough to cover my shoulders, and a photograph of Margaret laughing on the dashboard. I looked at the photograph for a while, then I closed my eyes. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep. Somewhere between thinking about Route 9 and thinking about the look on Connor's face, my brain just gave up and went somewhere else. That's the thing about exhaustion. There's a depth of it that bypasses everything. That doesn't care about grief or anger or the particular kind of loneliness that comes from sleeping in a truck in front of a house you helped buy. It just pulls you under. And you go. I slept for something like 4 hours. It wasn't good sleep. It was the kind of sleep that leaves you feeling like you've been wrung out and hung up to dry. But it was sleep. And at that point, sleep was the most valuable thing I had left. What I didn't know, while I was sleeping, was that I wasn't alone on that street. 2 houses down. On the opposite side of the road, a dark sedan sat with its engine running. No lights. Just the faint exhaust in the cold air and the barely visible outline of someone sitting behind the wheel. Still. Patient. The kind of still that isn't accidental. The kind of patient that belongs to someone who does this for a living. If I had been awake, I might have noticed it. I might have wondered who parks a car, running on a residential street at 2 in the morning, with no lights on. I might have felt the first small flutter of something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't quite not fear either. But I was asleep, and the sedan sat there, and the engine ran, and the person behind the wheel watched my truck with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who already knew exactly how the morning was going to begin. The first thing I was aware of was cold. Not the dramatic kind of cold that wakes you up gasping. The slow, settled kind that has been working its way into your bones for hours and has finally decided to introduce itself properly. My neck was stiff. My left knee, which has never forgiven me for 20 years of walking construction sites, was sending up its usual morning complaints with what I felt was unnecessary enthusiasm given everything else I was already dealing with. The second thing I was aware of was that someone was knocking on my window. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. Not the frantic kind that means emergency. Not the tentative kind that means apology. The kind that belongs to someone who has done this before and is entirely comfortable with however long it takes you to respond. My first thought was police. My second thought was that getting a vagrancy citation in my own son's neighborhood would be, objectively speaking, a new low, even by the standards of the past 3 weeks. My third thought, when I actually managed to open my eyes and focus them, was that the man standing outside my window did not look like any police officer I had ever encountered. He was somewhere in his late 60s. Tall, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from good genes but from decades of standing in rooms where posture matters. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat and leather gloves and shoes that had been polished recently and with intention. His hair was silver and cut close. His face was the face of a man who had spent a long career watching other people carefully and had gotten very good at not being watched in return. He knocked again. 3 more. Same rhythm. Same patience. I rolled down the window. The cold air came in immediately, decisive and unwelcome. "Mr. Hadley," the man said. I blinked. Outside, somewhere down the block, a sprinkler system had kicked on despite the temperature, because that is the kind of optimism that suburban irrigation systems operate on. Birds were doing what birds do in the morning. Normal sounds. Completely normal Wednesday morning sounds. "Yeah," I said. My voice had the texture of someone who had slept in a truck. "My name is Marcus Webb." He said it the way people say names that are supposed to mean something, then waited to see if it landed. When it didn't, because it didn't, he continued without any visible disappointment. "I'm a former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've been retired for 2 years. He paused. "I'd like to talk with you about the accident on Route 9, Mr. Hadley, and about some things connected to it that I think you're going to want to know." I looked at him. Then I looked at myself, which is to say, I looked at what I could see of myself in the rearview mirror. Jacket that had served as a blanket. Hair that had made its own decisions overnight. The general appearance of a man who had not planned on having a conversation this morning, or possibly ever again. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "I know quite a bit more than your name." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a business card, which he held out to me through the window. Plain white. His name, a phone number, and the words, "Investigative Consultant," in small letters below. "I've been looking into the Route 9 incident for the past 2 months. I was hired by Sandra Reeves, Danny Reeves's wife." I took the card. I looked at it. Danny Reeves. The name landed the way it always landed, which was heavily and in the center of the chest. "She doesn't believe it was an accident," I said. "No," Marcus said. "She doesn't. And after 2 months of looking at it, neither do I." The morning air was cold enough that I could see his breath when he spoke. Mine too, probably, though I was past caring about things like that. Down the street, a car started up and pulled out of a driveway and drove away toward whatever Wednesday had planned for its driver. Lucky Wednesday. Driver. I envied him genuinely. "Mr. Webb," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I have no money. I have no company. I have no house. I slept in this truck last night because the alternative was sleeping on the street, and the street didn't have a dashboard photograph I wanted to keep an eye on." I looked at him steadily. "I don't know what you think I can offer an investigation at this particular moment in my life." Marcus looked back at me with the same steady, unhurried attention he had been giving me since I opened the window. "Mr. Hadley," he said, "I'm not here because of what you can offer. I'm here because of what I can." He reached into his coat pocket again, this time producing not a card but a photograph. Standard print size. The kind you get from a drugstore. He held it out. "Before you look at that, I want you to know that I've been doing this work for 31 years, and I don't show people photographs without a reason." I took it. It was a shot of the Route 9 construction site. Taken from a distance, with a long lens, the kind of photograph that requires both equipment and intent. The timestamp in the corner read 5:48 in the morning, which was roughly 2 hours before Danny Reeves went to work, and roughly 2 hours and 12 minutes before Danny Reeves died. The site was mostly dark at that hour, but there was a figure in the frame, standing at the edge of the fourth-floor scaffolding, partially obscured by shadow, but there. Present. Deliberate. The body language of someone who was doing something and knew they shouldn't be. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I looked up at Marcus Webb, who was watching me with the patient expression of a man who has already done all of his own processing and is now simply waiting for yours to catch up. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Security camera from the building across the street," he said. "It took me 6 weeks to find it, because the original footage from the site cameras was wiped the morning of the accident, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is not something that happens by accident." I looked at the photograph again, at the figure on the scaffolding, at the deliberate stillness of someone who knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. Something cold moved through me. Not the weather kind of cold, the other kind. "Mr. Webb," I said slowly. "Marcus," he said. "Please, Marcus." I looked at him. "Do you know who that is?" He held my gaze for a moment. Then he opened the passenger door of my truck and got in, moving with the economy of someone who doesn't waste gestures, and pulled the door shut behind him. "That," he said, settling into the seat and looking straight ahead through the windshield at the quiet suburban street, "is what I need your help figuring out. Start the engine, Tom. It's cold, and we have a lot to talk about." I started the engine. It turned over on the first try, which was more than I could say for most things in my life at that moment, and I was briefly grateful for small mercies. The heater kicked in slowly, the way heaters do when they've been sitting in the cold all night, pushing out air that started lukewarm and gradually committed to the idea of warmth. Marcus sat in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap and looked straight ahead, giving me time to pull out onto the street and get moving before he said anything. I appreciated that. It's a particular skill, knowing when to let silence do the work. We drove for a few minutes without speaking. The neighborhood scrolled past on both sides, all trimmed hedges and recycling bins put out for Wednesday collection, and the general air of people who had their lives sufficiently organized to remember what day the recycling went out. I had not remembered what day the recycling went out in approximately 3 weeks. This felt like relevant information about the state of my existence. "Tell me what you know about the structural failure," Marcus said finally. Not a question. More like an invitation to begin. "I know what the initial report said," I told him. "Compromised, load-bearing joint on the 4th floor. The investigation found that the joint had been installed incorrectly, that the specifications hadn't been followed." I paused, which didn't make sense to me. My site foreman had been doing this work for 22 years. The crew on that floor had done similar work on 6 previous projects without incident. "The specifications," Marcus said. "Which specifications exactly?" "The structural engineering drawings for the 4th floor framing. There's a particular connection detail, a moment frame junction, that requires precise torque values on the anchor bolts. It's not complicated if you know what you're doing. And my crew knew what they were doing. The OSHA report concluded the anchor bolts were under-torqued by a significant margin," I said. "Which is what I'm telling you doesn't make sense. You don't under-torque a moment frame junction by that margin through carelessness. That's not a small mistake. That's not someone having a bad day. That margin requires either profound incompetence, which my crew didn't have, or deliberate intervention." Marcus nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how much to give me and in what order. I had met people like Marcus before, not many, but a few. People who had spent careers managing the sequence of revelations. You learned to read the pauses. "The anchor bolts on that junction were replaced," he said. I kept my eyes on the road. "What do you mean replaced?" "I mean that the bolts that failed were not the bolts that your crew installed. Somebody went in after your crew finished that section, removed the correctly installed hardware, and substituted bolts that had been deliberately under-torqued and in 2 cases structurally compromised. He said it the way you say things you have spent a long time being certain of. Flatly. Without drama. This was done sometime in the 48 hours before the accident. The materials analysis came back last week. Sandra Reeves paid for it privately because the official investigation wasn't going to commission it. The road stretched out ahead of us. I drove. I breathed. Someone went onto my site, I said, in the middle of the night, and replaced structural hardware on a 4th-floor junction, knowing that when that floor was loaded, it would fail. Knowing that whoever was working on that floor when it failed would, yes, Marcus said again quietly. That's what the evidence says. I drove for another half-mile without speaking. Outside, Nashville was waking up around us, going about its Wednesday with the cheerful indifference of a city that didn't know what I had just been told. I found myself looking at the other drivers at red lights, normal faces, coffee cups, radio stations, the particular 1,000-yard stare of people commuting somewhere they'd rather not be, but will be again tomorrow. I envied every single one of them so completely it almost felt like affection. The figure in the photograph, I said. On the scaffolding, at 5:48. We believe that's when the substitution was made. Or the final check of it. At minimum. And the site cameras, wiped remotely. The system had a cloud backup component that most people didn't know about, including, apparently, whoever wiped the local footage. We recovered partial data, enough to see that someone accessed the camera system from an external IP address at 5:51 that morning. 3 minutes after your photograph was taken. He paused. Whoever did this knew the site, knew the camera system, knew the structural drawings well enough to identify exactly which junction would cause a catastrophic failure when compromised. And there it was. I felt it before I fully thought it, the way you sometimes feel the shape of something in the dark before you can actually see it. A specific kind of knowing that starts in the stomach and works its way up. The structural drawings for Route 9 were not public documents. They were not filed with the city in their complete form. The full engineering package, including the detailed connection specifications for every junction on every floor, existed in exactly 2 places. On the secure server of the engineering firm that drew them up, and in the project files of Hadley Construction. Within Hadley Construction, full access to those drawings had been granted to exactly 2 people. Me. And one other. The blueprints, Marcus said. And I realized he had been watching me from the corner of his eye for the last 30 seconds, reading whatever was happening on my face. The full, structural package for Route 9. Who else had complete access? The name was right there. It had been right there since he said the words, deliberate intervention, 20 minutes ago, waiting for me to be ready to look at it directly. I wasn't sure I was ready. I wasn't sure ready was something I was going to get to be. I knew who it was. I knew the way you know things you've been trying not to know. The way you know when a sound in the house at 3 in the morning isn't the house settling. The way you know when someone you love is lying to you, even when every other part of you is insisting they wouldn't. I knew, but I couldn't say the name out loud yet. Not in this truck, not on this road, not on this particular Wednesday morning when I had already been asked to absorb more than seemed physiologically reasonable. The name sat in my chest like something swallowed wrong, and I drove, and I did not say it. Tom. Marcus said gently. Give me a minute. I said. He gave me a minute. It was the longest minute I can remember. Marcus gave me my minute. Then he gave me another one without being asked, which told me something about the kind of man he was. 31 years in federal investigations teaches you the difference between silence that is obstruction and silence that is a person trying to hold something together. He looked out the passenger window and did not push, and I was grateful for it in the uncomplicated way. You are grateful for things when you have very little left to be grateful for. I need you to understand something before I say this name, I told him finally. Because otherwise it's just a name. And it isn't just a name. Okay, he said. I'm going to have to go back a little. Take whatever time you need. So I went back. 15 years, which felt like going back to a different country. Back to 2008, which was a terrible year for almost everyone, and a particularly interesting year for two men in their mid-40s who had decided, against the advice of several sensible people, to start a construction company in the middle of a financial crisis. The office was on Gallatin Pike, second floor of a building that also housed a tax preparation service and a martial arts studio. On certain mornings, you could hear the instructor counting out kicks through the ceiling, which was either motivating or distracting depending on how the bids were going. We had 2 desks. One printer that jammed every 3rd page with a consistency I came to find almost admirable. A whiteboard, where we wrote the names of every project we were going to win. We won more of them than anyone expected. His name was Dean Whitfield. There it is. The name that had been sitting in my chest since Marcus said the words, "complete access to those drawings." Dean Whitfield. 58 years old now, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of a man who has been right about enough things that being right starts to feel like a personality trait. We had met through a mutual contact in 2006. Coffee twice, then lunch, then a 2-hour conversation in a Home Depot parking lot in Antioch that covered everything from building codes to family to what we each thought we were capable of with the right partner. I drove home from that parking lot and told Margaret I had just met the person I was going to build something with. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You've said that before." Then she said, "But you haven't said it like that before." And that was that. Dean was good at the things I wasn't. I could read a site, walk a building, know in my bones whether it was going to stand. Dean was good at rooms, at sitting across from a city official or a bank officer and making them feel understood. He had a way of listening that made people feel like the most interesting person he had ever listened to. In a business that runs on relationships, that is not a small thing. We built Hadley Construction over 7 years. Carefully, the way you build something you want to last. We were both old enough and had both lost enough to know that fast and flashy is for people who haven't paid for anything yet. By 2015, it was something we were both genuinely proud of, which is rarer in a business partnership than people think. Then 2011 happened. Dean called me on a Thursday night in February at 11:30. Late enough that I knew before I picked up something was wrong. Margaret was asleep. I took the call in the kitchen, standing in the dark, and what Dean told me in the next 20 minutes was that he had made a series of financial decisions that had compounded badly, and that he was, as of that Thursday, facing the loss of everything he had outside of the company. I stood in the dark and listened. Then I went upstairs and woke Margaret. She was not thrilled about being woken at midnight, which was fair. I told her what Dean had said. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her particular skills, the quality of her attention, the sense that when you spoke to Margaret, the words actually landed somewhere before anything came back. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to help him," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking what you want to do about it." We talked for an hour. By the end, we had agreed to liquidate a portion of our personal savings, enough to cover Dean's most pressing obligations and give him solid ground again. It was not a small amount. It was the kind of number that changes what retirement looks like. Margaret knew that. She agreed anyway, because that was the kind of person she was, and because she understood that some things matter more than the number. The next morning I called Dean and told him what we were prepared to do. There was a silence on the other end, unlike any I had heard from him before. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted in a way I had never heard from him and would not hear again until much later, under very different circumstances. "Tom," he said, "I will never forget this." I believed him. I believed it completely. The uncomplicated way you believe things when the evidence in front of you supports them and you have no reason to look for evidence anywhere else. 15 years later, sitting in a truck on a Nashville street, I was still thinking about that sentence when Marcus said quietly, Dean Whitfield. I looked at him. You already knew, I said. I needed to hear you say it, he said. Or not say it. Either one tells me what I need to know. He paused. I'm sorry, Tom. I mean that. I turned back to the road. The city moved around us, full of people going places, carrying their ordinary Wednesdays with them, like something they'd packed without thinking about. Where are we going? I asked. There's someone who deserves to be part of this conversation, Marcus said. Someone who has waited a long time for it. The years after 2011 were the best years of Hadley construction. I don't say that to be ironic. I say it because it's true, and because the truth of it is part of what makes everything else so difficult to sit with. When you've built something good with someone, when you've watched it grow from 2 desks and a jamming printer into a company with 40 full-time employees and a reputation that took a decade to earn, you don't easily give up the story you've been telling yourself about how that happened. About who was there beside you when it did. Dean was there for all of it. The first big municipal contract in 2012. The expansion into commercial work in 2014. The year we won 3 projects simultaneously and had to hire 12 people in 6 weeks, and I didn't sleep properly for 2 months. Dean was in the office every morning before I was, which I noticed and appreciated, and he stayed every evening until the work was done, which I also noticed and which I now understand differently than I did then. He was at every company milestone, every ribbon cutting, every handshake with every city official. He gave a toast at the 10-year anniversary dinner that made several of our contractors cry, which is not an easy thing to do to people who pour concrete for a living. He talked about what we had built together and what it meant, and he did it with the kind of specificity and warmth that can only come, you think, from someone who means it. I thought he meant it. Margaret liked him. That mattered to me more than I would have admitted at the time. Margaret had a particular sensitivity to people who were performing as opposed to being, and she had never flagged Dean as one of the performers. She invited him to dinners. She remembered his coffee order. When his mother passed in 2017, she sent flowers and a handwritten card, which she did not do for everyone. When Margaret got sick, Dean was one of the first people I told. It was pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. Which the oncologist explained to us in a voice calibrated carefully between honest and kind, is not the stage you want it to be. We had 14 months. We used them as well as 2 people can use 14 months when one of them is trying to stay alive and the other is trying to make every ordinary Tuesday feel like something worth keeping. Dean came to the house regularly during those 14 months. He handled more of the day-to-day at the company than was strictly his responsibility, without being asked and without making me feel the weight of what he was carrying on my behalf. When I needed to leave early for appointments, he covered. When I needed to not come in at all, he covered that too. He showed up to the house one Saturday morning with groceries and spent 3 hours in our kitchen making Margaret's favorite soup, a thing he had apparently looked up the recipe for because Dean did not cook and had never claimed to. Margaret died on a Tuesday in March, 2 years ago. It was early morning. The light was just coming through the bedroom curtains, the particular gray-blue light of early spring in Tennessee. And she was there, and then she was not, and the space between those 2 things was so small and so enormous at the same time that I am not sure I have ever fully crossed it. Dean was at the funeral. He stood beside me at the graveside in a dark suit, with his hands clasped in front of him, and did not say anything. Because there was nothing to say, which was the right call. He drove me home afterward. He sat with me in the kitchen for 2 hours while people came and went and brought food that I would not eat and said things that I could not hear. He was still there when everyone else had gone, washing dishes quietly at the sink, and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the roses Margaret had planted along the back fence and did not speak, and he did not require me to. That was Dean Whitfield. That was the man I am telling you about, which is why, when the accident happened on Route 9 8 months later, he was the first person I called, before my lawyer, before my insurance broker, before anyone else who had a professional reason to be involved. I called Dean. I called him because he was my partner, and because he had stood beside me at the worst moment of my life, and because I trusted him the way you trust Someone who has shown up for you consistently and without condition over 15 years. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened, and he said, without hesitation, in the voice of a man who has handled crises before and knows how to sound steady inside them, "Don't worry, Tom. I'll handle everything." 4 words. I'll handle everything. I had heard Dean say those words before, in smaller situations, and they had always meant exactly what they sounded like. They had always meant that the thing would be handled, and I could trust him to handle it. So I trusted him. I handed him the weight of it, and I went back to trying to manage the legal and financial pieces that were already piling up around me, and I let Dean handle everything. I was still thinking about those 4 words, sitting in the truck with Marcus as we turned off the main road into a quieter neighborhood of small houses and mature trees, when Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a large envelope, yellow, the heavy kind, slightly worn at the corners, as though it had been carried around for a while before this moment. He set it on the dashboard between us. My name was written on the front in black ink. By hand, in writing I didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate letters. The kind of writing that takes its time. "Before you open that," Marcus said, "I want you to pull over." I pulled over. I looked at the envelope. It sat on the dashboard and did not move and did not explain itself, the way envelopes don't. And I looked at my name written on the front of it and felt, for the first time since Wednesday morning began, something that was not grief or anger or exhaustion, but something older and quieter than any of those things. "What's in it?" I asked. Marcus looked straight ahead. "The reason I knew Dean Whitfield's name before you said it," he said. I pulled over on a side street I didn't know the name of, in a neighborhood I had never had a reason to be in before, and I sat with the yellow envelope on the dashboard and did not immediately reach for it. There is a specific hesitation that comes before opening something you suspect will change things. It isn't fear exactly, though fear is part of it. It's more like the last moment of a version of yourself that still gets to not know. Once you open it, you can't go back to the person who hadn't. I had already lost enough versions of myself in the past 3 weeks that one more shouldn't have mattered. And yet there I sat, hands in my lap, looking at my own name written in someone else's careful hand. "Take your time," Marcus said. I picked up the envelope. The flap had been sealed and then carefully opened at some point, resealed with a strip of clear tape. Someone had gone to the trouble of making it look undisturbed while ensuring it could be opened without damage. A professional habit. I filed that away. Inside were 3 things. A photograph, printed on standard paper, a document, several pages, stapled at the corner, and a single printed email, folded twice. I started with the photograph. It showed 2 men at a restaurant table. The shot had been taken from a distance, through glass, with a long lens, the kind of photograph that requires planning and patience. The image was sharp enough to be useful. Both men were leaning forward over the table in the particular posture of people discussing something they don't want overheard. One of them I didn't recognize. The other one I had known for 15 years, Dean Whitfield. Sitting across from a man I would later learn was Victor Harlan. The timestamp on the photograph read 14 months ago. 4 months before the accident on Route 9. 2 months before Danny Reeves went to work one Tuesday morning and didn't come home. I set the photograph down and picked up the document. It was a contract, or the framework of 12 pages of language that my lawyer would have needed to translate for me in full, but that I could read well enough to understand the shape of. It was an agreement between a holding company called Whitfield Consulting LLC, which I had not known existed, and Harlan Development Group, which I knew very well. Victor Harlan's company, our largest competitor in the Nashville commercial construction market for the past 8 years. The agreement outlined a consulting arrangement. Services to be rendered. Compensation to be paid. The language was careful and vague in the way that language is careful and vague when the people writing it know exactly what they're describing and don't want anyone else to. But buried in the middle pages, In a section about deliverables and timelines, there were phrases that were harder to make vague. Phrases about market positioning, about the elimination of competitive obstacles, about the transfer of certain proprietary project information. Proprietary project information. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I set the document down and picked up the folded email. I unfolded it slowly. It was printed from Dean's personal email account. The address was one I recognized, the one he used for non-company correspondence, the one he had given me years ago for emergencies. The recipient was an address I didn't recognize but which I noted contained the initials VH. The date at the top of the email was what stopped me first. It had been sent 11 days after Margaret's funeral. 11 days. I counted it twice. Margaret had been in the ground for 11 days. When Dean Whitfield sat down at whatever desk, in whatever room, and wrote this email, and I had been in my house eating food people brought over and looking at her roses through the kitchen window and trying to remember what the point of getting up in the morning was. And Dean had been doing this. The email was not long. 6 sentences. The first 3 discussed timing. The project was on schedule, it said. The window they had discussed was still viable. The personnel on the 4th floor section had been confirmed. The 4th sentence was the one that did it. He won't be paying attention right now. This is the right time to move. I read that sentence 4 times. I read it the way you read something, when your brain keeps trying to make it mean something other than what it means, and keeps failing. He won't be paying attention right now. Dean Whitfield, 11 days after Margaret's funeral, writing to Victor Harlan that Tom Hadley was too deep in grief to notice what was being done to him, using her death as a scheduling tool. The 5th and 6th sentences were logistical. I didn't read them carefully. I'm not sure I could have. I folded the email back along its creases. My hands were steady. I noted that with the detached interest of a man watching himself from a small distance, the way you sometimes do when something is too large to be inside of completely. My hands were steady and my breathing was even, and somewhere underneath both of those things something was happening that I didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't anger, though anger was in there. It was something older, something that had been sitting in the human chest since long before anyone had words for what goes in the human chest. Tom, Marcus said, "Give me a second." He gave me a second. I looked out the windshield at the quiet street. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk across from us, moving at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere to be, until later. The dog stopped to investigate something in the grass. The woman waited. Normal. Ordinary. Completely ordinary Wednesday morning. I put the email, the document, and the photograph back into the yellow envelope. I held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Then I set it on the seat between us. "Victor Harlan," I said. "He's been trying to absorb Hadley's market share for 8 years, Marcus said. With you out of the picture, he picks up at least 4 of your active contracts immediately. Probably more within the year. And Dean had debts again. Different ones this time. The kind he couldn't come to you with a second time." I thought about that. About a man deciding that the person who had once pulled him back from the edge was now more useful to him as a casualty than as a partner. About the particular calculation that requires. About what it costs a person to make it. Or whether, for some people, it doesn't cost anything at all. "Where are we going?" I asked again. "Sandra Reeves," Marcus said. "She needs to hear what you just heard. And there's something she has that you need to see." Sandra Reeves lived on Fern Valley Road, in a part of East Nashville that hadn't yet been discovered by the kind of people who discover neighborhoods and turn them into something else. The houses were small and well kept in the way that requires consistent effort rather than money. Lawns that someone mowed regularly. Gutters that someone cleaned before winter. The kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names and noticed when someone's lights didn't come on at the usual time. We parked in front of a white house with green trim and a concrete path leading to the front door. There was a pot of mums on the porch steps, orange and yellow, recently watered. Beside it, a pair of work boots that were too large to belong to anyone currently living in that house. I looked at the boots for a moment before getting out of the truck. She knows we're coming? I asked. I called ahead, Marcus said. She knows about you. About the envelope. She's been waiting for this conversation for 2 months. We walked up the path. Marcus knocked. I stood slightly behind him and to the left, which was not a conscious decision but felt like the right amount of not putting myself forward in a situation where I had not yet earned the right to put myself forward. The door opened. Sandra Reeves was 45 years old and looked like someone who had spent the past year and a half doing the work of grief without the luxury of stopping. Not broken. That's important. Not broken in the way people sometimes expect a widow to look when they open the door. She was put together, hair pulled back, a flannel shirt over dark jeans, the kind of composed that costs something to maintain. Her eyes were brown and direct, and they moved to me immediately, not to Marcus, as though she had been thinking about what Tom Hadley looked like and was now checking her expectations against the reality. Whatever she found, she didn't say. Sandra, Marcus said. This is Tom Hadley. I know who he is, she said. Not unkindly. Just precisely. She stepped back from the door. Come in. The inside of the house was the inside of a life being carefully continued. Photographs on the walls. The kind that accumulate over years of ordinary happiness. A man in a hard hat, grinning on a job site. A family at a lake somewhere, squinting into summer sun. A boy at various ages, doing the things boys do at various ages. The furniture was comfortable and slightly mismatched in the way of people who buy things because they need them rather than because they go together. It smelled like coffee and something faintly floral, a candle somewhere in another room. On the kitchen table there was a legal pad covered in handwriting, a laptop, and 3 empty coffee cups that suggested the morning had started early and with intention. Sandra poured 2 more cups without asking and set them on the table and sat down across from where Marcus and I settled into chairs. She folded her hands in front of her on the table. She looked at me steadily. Marcus tells me you've seen the envelope, she said. Then you know what I know. Or most of it. She paused. I hired Marcus because the official investigation wasn't asking the right questions. Or wasn't asking them loudly enough. I don't know which one. I spent 4 months asking them myself and getting the kind of answers that are designed to make you stop asking. Her voice was even. Controlled. Danny went to work that morning because he trusted that someone had made sure it was safe to go to work. He trusted your company, Mr. Hadley. I know, I said. I'm not saying that to make you feel worse than you already do, she said. I'm saying it because I want you to understand why I kept going when it would have been easier to stop. Danny trusted someone. That trust was used against him. I needed to know by who and I needed it to be on record. There was nothing I could usefully add to that. So I didn't try. We talked for a few minutes about the investigation. About the materials analysis Sandra had commissioned privately. About the pieces Marcus had assembled over 2 months. She was precise and organized in the way of someone who has gone over the same information so many times it has become part of her, and I listened and tried to be useful where I could, and mostly stayed out of the way of her telling it. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. The young man who appeared in the kitchen doorway was 19 years old and carrying the specific energy of someone who had been told to stay upstairs and had decided that wasn't going to work for him anymore. He was tall, with his father's build if the photographs on the wall were any indication. And he looked at me with an expression that I recognized from a long time ago. From the mirror. From the years when I was young enough to believe that the correct response to injustice was to put your body between it and the person it was aimed at. Jake, Sandra said. A single word, a whole conversation inside it. I heard the truck, he said. He was looking at me. Not at Marcus. At me. You're Hadley. I am, I said. My dad worked for you for 4 years. He did. He talked about you. Jake's jaw was tight. He said you ran a good operation. He said you were one of the straight ones. The word straight came out with an edge on it that had been put there by 18 months of thinking about what his father's trust had cost. So I want to know what you're doing here. In my mom's kitchen. On a Wednesday morning, I looked at him for a moment. He was 19 years old and he had lost his father, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway doing the only thing he knew how to do about it, which was to stand there and not move, and make sure whoever was in the room knew he was paying attention. "Your father deserved better than what happened to him," I said. "So do you. So does your mother. And I'm here because the people who made sure he didn't get better are not going to get to walk away from it. Not if I have anything to say about it." Jake looked at me for a long moment. The edge didn't disappear entirely. I didn't expect it to, and I wouldn't have trusted it if it had. But something in his posture shifted. The particular shift of someone who came in ready for one kind of conversation and is recalibrating for another. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Then he reached across the table and picked up a small notebook with a blue cover, worn at the corners. The kind you get at a drugstore for $1.99. He set it in the middle of the table between us. "My dad wrote everything down," Jake said. "He always did. Every job, every site, everything he noticed." He looked at me steadily. "So, and every site. He noticed some things on Route 9 that he didn't think were right. He wrote them down too." I looked at the notebook. Then I looked at Jake. Then I reached across the table and picked it up. The notebook was the kind that costs less than $2 at any drugstore in America. Blue cardboard cover, slightly warped at the corners from being carried in a back pocket. The wire spiral binding had been bent slightly out of shape, the way it gets when someone opens the notebook flat against a hard surface repeatedly. A workbench, or a tailgate, or a concrete floor. The kind of wear that comes from actual use, rather than from sitting on a desk looking purposeful. I opened it. Danny Reeves had handwriting that was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that space was limited and information was important and you didn't waste either one. Each entry was dated at the top right corner. The earliest date I could see was 14 months ago, which placed the beginning of this notebook roughly around the same time that the photograph in the yellow envelope had been taken. The photograph of Dean and Victor Harlan leaning over a restaurant table. I did not think that was a coincidence. The early entries were straightforward work notes. Delivery times, material quantities, names of subcontractors, and what they had and hadn't completed. The kind of granular documentation that a careful worker keeps because the job goes better when someone is paying attention to the details, and because 22 years on construction sites teaches you that the details are where everything either holds together or falls apart. Danny Reeves had been paying attention. About 6 months into the notebook, the entries began to change. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have stood out to anyone reading casually. But the things Danny was noting shifted from purely operational observations to something more careful, more watchful. First mention: 5 months before the accident. Gray pickup truck. Older model. No company markings. Parked outside the site perimeter 2 mornings in a row. Danny had written the partial plate number, 3 letters and 2 numbers, the rest obscured by distance or angle. I couldn't tell which. Second mention, 3 weeks later. Same truck, different position. Closer to the site entrance this time. Danny had noted the time, 6:15 in the morning, which was before the crew arrived, which was before anyone who had a legitimate reason to be there would have been there. Third mention, 6 weeks before the accident. The truck again. This time Danny had written something beside the entry that he hadn't written before. A question. 3 words. Should I say something? N. He hadn't circled it. Hadn't underlined it. Just written it and then, apparently, gone on to the next entry, which was about a concrete delivery that arrived 40 minutes late and short by 3 cubic yards. I read that question 3 times. Should I say something? A careful man on a job site noticing something that didn't belong. Writing it down because writing things down was what he did, and then asking himself the question that careful people ask when they notice things that don't belong. Whether to surface it, whether to make it someone else's problem, whether to trust that the people above you in the chain are the right people to trust. I turned the pages more slowly now. The entries in the final 2 weeks before the accident were different in tone from everything before them. Shorter, more clipped. The handwriting was the same, but the space between the lines had decreased. The way handwriting compresses when the person writing is under pressure or moving quickly or both. Danny had still been documenting. He had still been paying attention. But something had changed in what he was seeing or how he was seeing it. 4 days before the accident, he had written, "Fourth floor junction work completed ahead of schedule." Unusual. Nobody runs ahead on a junction section. 3 days before. Gray truck again. Different plates this time. Why different plates? 2 days before. Asked Kowalski if he'd seen the truck. He hadn't. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's nothing. 1 day before, the final full entry. The man in the gray truck was on site today. Not outside. On site. I saw him near the material staging area on 4. He left before I could get close. I don't know who cleared him through. I should tell Mr. Hadley. I'll tell him tomorrow. I closed the notebook. The kitchen was quiet. Sandra had both hands around her coffee cup. Jake was looking at the table. Marcus was looking at me. Outside, somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up. Someone getting a late season cut in before the weather changed for good. He was going to tell me, I said. It came out quieter than I intended. I know, Sandra said. I put the notebook flat on the table and looked at it for a moment. At the blue cover worn at the corners. At the bent wire spiral. At the $2 worth of cardboard and paper that contained, in small, precise handwriting, the record of a man paying careful attention to something that was going to kill him. Jake reached across and turned the notebook over so the cover faced down. A small gesture. The kind you make when you can't do anything large. Marcus leaned forward and unfolded a road map of Nashville on the table between us, the old paper kind, which I hadn't seen anyone use in years and which somehow felt appropriate. He smoothed it flat with both hands. The partial plate Danny recorded in the first entry, Marcus said, pointing to a note in his own handwriting in the margin of the map. We ran it 3 weeks ago. It comes back to a vehicle registered to a holding company called CRV Properties LLC. He moved his finger to a spot on the map, east of downtown, near the industrial corridor along the river. CRV Properties LLC shares a registered agent with 2 other holding companies. One of them is a company called Harlan Logistics, which is a subsidiary of Harlan Development Group. I looked at the spot on the map. Victor Harlan's people were on my site, I said. For at least 2 months before the accident, Marcus said. Watching. Learning the schedule. Learning the crew rotation. Learning which junction section would be worked on which day. He paused. And someone on the inside was making sure they had that information. Jake put his finger on the spot Marcus had indicated. Then he moved it to another spot, slightly north. This is where Danny used to say the truck was parked, he said. He described it to me once. I didn't know what he was describing at the time. He looked up from the map. His eyes were dry. He had, I suspected, run out of tears some time ago. And what was left was the harder, cleaner thing that comes after tears are done. What do we do now? He asked. It was directed at all 3 of us equally. The question of a young man who had spent 18 months watching the adults around him failed to answer it, and was now sitting at a table with 2 of them and asking it again. One more time, with a patience that was more demanding than any anger could have been. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. We find the truck, I said. The industrial corridor along the river in East Nashville is the kind of place that exists in every mid-size American city, and that most people who don't work there drive past without looking at. Warehouses with roll-up doors and loading docks. Fenced lots holding equipment that costs more than the buildings it's stored next to. The occasional business with a hand-painted sign that has been there long enough that nobody questions whether it belongs. The kind of neighborhood that operates on a schedule most of the city never sees. Busy before dawn and quiet by mid-afternoon, populated by people who have somewhere specific to be and no particular interest in who else might be around. Marcus knew the area. He directed me off the main road and into a grid of narrower streets that ran between the larger warehouse buildings. Streets without sidewalks and with potholes that my truck navigated with the resigned familiarity of a vehicle that has been on job sites. Jake sat in the back seat and said nothing, which I had come to understand was his particular version of paying close attention. "Third block down," Marcus said. "Left side. There should be a fenced lot between two warehouse units. Gray metal fencing. Maybe 8 feet. Padlock on the gate. Should be," I said. "Was, as of 4 days ago," he said. "These things move. They didn't always move." The lot was there. Exactly where Marcus had said it would be, gray metal fencing and a padlock on the gate, and a strip of cracked asphalt inside that held 3 vehicles parked at angles to each other, as though whoever had left them there had been in a hurry, or hadn't cared about alignment, or both. One flatbed trailer with a blown tire listing to the right, one panel van with no plates, and one gray pickup truck. Older model. Sitting in the back corner of the lot facing the fence. I pulled over across the street and cut the engine. The 3 of us sat for a moment, looking at it through the windshield. The truck sat in the lot with the complete stillness of something that hasn't been moved in a while, and there was something about that stillness that felt significant in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. It had been there. It had done what it was sent to do. And now it was just sitting in a fenced lot in East Nashville on a Wednesday morning while the river moved past 2 blocks away and the rest of the city went about its business. "How do we get in?" Jake asked from the back seat. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather case about the size of a wallet. He held it up briefly, then put it back. 31 years, he said simply. "You pick up skills." We got out of the truck. The street was empty in both directions, which was either good timing or the kind of quiet that should make you pay attention. Marcus approached the gate with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done this kind of thing enough times that his body no longer registers it as unusual. The padlock was open in under a minute. The gate swung inward without noise, which told me someone maintained it, which told me someone came here with some regularity. We crossed to the gray truck. The cab was unlocked, which surprised me until Marcus pointed out, without being asked, that locked vehicles in lots like this attract more attention than unlocked ones, because locked ones suggest there's something worth locking. The interior smelled like cigarettes, and something chemical that I couldn't identify and didn't particularly want to. Fast food wrappers on the passenger floor. A pair of work gloves on the dash, a phone charger plugged into the console with nothing attached to it. Marcus went to the truck bed. I followed. Jake stood at the corner of the truck, keeping watch, without being asked to, which told me something about him. In the bed of the truck, under a blue tarp that had been folded rather than secured, there was a metal lockbox, the kind you get at a hardware store for $50. Marcus looked at it for a moment, then looked at me, then produced a folding tool from his pocket, and went to work on the lock, with the focused patience of someone who has learned that most locks are less committed to their purpose than they appear. The box came open. Inside were 2 things. A burner phone, powered off, the cheap kind that comes in a blister pack, and a manila folder, thick, held shut with a rubber band. Marcus put on a pair of latex gloves from his coat pocket, which he apparently carried the way other people carry breath mints, and opened the folder. He went through the contents quickly, efficiently, in the manner of a man reading a document type he has read many times before. Then he set the folder flat on the truck bed and turned it so I could see. It was a contract, but not the framework document from the yellow envelope. This was the real one, fully executed. Signatures on every page, initials in every margin, notarized on the final page with a stamp and a date. The date was 3 months before the accident on Route 9. Dean Whitfield's signature was on the left side of the signature block. I recognized his handwriting from 15 years of looking at it on purchase orders and change orders and birthday cards, and a 10-year anniversary toast written on a legal pad that he had read from at the dinner, and then given to me to keep. Victor Harlan's signature was on the right. Between the two signatures, in the body of the contract above them, was language that was no longer vague. This version did not speak of consulting arrangements and market positioning. This version spoke plainly. In the specific way that people speak plainly when they believe the document will never be seen by anyone who isn't already implicated by it. It described a coordinated effort to discredit Hadley Construction through the engineering of a workplace safety incident. It used that phrase, the engineering of a workplace safety incident. It described timelines. It described methods. It described compensation. Danny Reeves was not mentioned by name. He was referred to, in the one place where his existence was relevant to the document, as potential collateral impact, acceptable within agreed parameters. I read that phrase once. I did not read it again. Jake had moved from his post at the corner of the truck and was now standing beside me, close enough to see the document. I heard him breathe in, and then not breathe out for a moment. The specific pause of a person encountering something that requires a second to become real. Photograph everything, Marcus said to Jake, who already had his phone out. Jake documented every page methodically, without being told twice, without shaking, with the steady hands of someone who had decided some time ago what kind of person he was going to be when the moment required it. Marcus was reaching for his own phone when I saw it. At the end of the street, 2 blocks down, moving slowly in our direction with its lights off in the middle of a Wednesday morning. A black sedan. Marcus, I said. He was already looking. I see it. Same one from last night? Same model, he said. He closed the lockbox, replaced the tarp, and was moving toward the gate before he finished the sentence. Jake, you have everything? Everything, Jake said, already following. Then we need to leave. Right now. We moved fast, but not frantically, which was Marcus's doing. There is a difference between speed that looks like panic and speed that looks like purpose, and Marcus moved with purpose the way he did everything else. Efficiently and without wasted motion, and I followed his lead because he had 31 years of knowing when to run and when to walk quickly, and this apparently qualified as the latter. We were back through the gate and into my truck in under a minute. Marcus pulled the gate closed behind us as we left, which struck me as either professional habit or a specific kind of tidiness that I found unexpectedly reassuring under the circumstances. Jake was in the back seat with his phone in both hands, checking that the photographs had uploaded somewhere before the phone could be taken or damaged. He was doing this calmly, systematically, in the manner of someone who had thought through contingencies. I started the engine and pulled out, heading away from the sedan, taking the first corner at a pace that was brisk, without being the kind of brisk that gets you noticed. In the rearview mirror, the sedan continued its slow progress up the original street, either not having seen us leave or not yet having decided what to do about it. Don't get on the main road yet, Marcus said. Stay in the industrial grid for 2 more blocks, then cut north. I stayed in the grid. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. A delivery truck here. A man moving something on a dolly between 2 warehouse loading docks there, the ordinary commerce of a part of the city that operates on different hours from the rest of it. Normal. We were just another truck on a street full of trucks. And after 2 more blocks, the sedan was no longer visible in the mirror, and the particular tension in the back of my jaw began to ease slightly. They know someone was there, Marcus said. Once we had turned north and the industrial corridor was behind us. Whether they know who is another question. Does it matter? I asked. It matters in terms of how quickly things need to move from here, he said. If they know it was you, Dean will know within the hour. Which means we lose the element of whatever surprise we currently have. He looked at me. Tom, we have enough now. The folder contents, Jake's photographs, the materials analysis Sandra commissioned, the footage fragments from the backup camera. That's a federal case. I can have this in front of the right people by end of day. I know, I said, but that's not what you want to do first. It wasn't a question. He had been reading me accurately all morning, and there was no particular reason to think he would stop now. I need to talk to Dean before this goes federal, I said. I need to look at him. And I need him to look at me. And I need that to happen before lawyers and investigators and process take over and make it into something with procedures and distances. I kept my eyes on the road. He stood at Margaret's grave. He sat in my kitchen the night she died and washed dishes at my sink. I need him to be a person in a room with me one more time before he becomes a case file. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, Nashville moved around us, transitioning from the industrial east toward the more populated center of the city. The buildings getting taller and closer together, the streets getting busier with the mid-morning traffic of people who had somewhere to be. I'm not going to tell you that's the strategically optimal choice, Marcus said finally. I know, but I understand it, he said. And I'm not going to stop you. We drove back to Fern Valley Road. Sandra met us at the door before we knocked, which meant she had been watching for us, which meant the time we had been gone had not been easy time for her. Marcus gave her a brief and precise account of what we had found, including the full contract and Jake's photographs, and her expression during this account was the expression of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had always known, but had never been entirely certain she would be able to prove. Not satisfaction. Closer to the particular exhaustion of finally being able to put something down that you have been carrying for a long time. Jake sat at the kitchen table and transferred his photographs to Sandra's laptop, and then to a cloud account, and then to Marcus's phone, creating redundancies with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the value of information is directly proportional to how many places it exists simultaneously. Marcus pulled me aside while Jake and Sandra worked. I'm going to make some calls, he said quietly. Federal contacts. People I trust. I'm going to make sure that what Jake photographed is in the right hands before you walk into that building. He held my gaze. By the time you sit down with Dean Whitfield, there will already be people moving on this. Which means, whatever happens in that room, whatever he says or doesn't say, it doesn't change the outcome. You understand? I understand. You're not going in there to get a confession. You're not going in there to build a case. The case is already built. He paused. You're going in there for yourself. That's okay. Just know the difference. I thought about that for a moment. About the difference between justice and whatever it is you need for yourself that justice doesn't quite cover. I had spent 62 years believing those two things were roughly the same. I was not sure I still believed that, but I was also not sure what to do with the uncertainty, so I set it aside for later. Jake, I said, turning back to the kitchen. He looked up from the laptop. Stay here with your mother, I said. Marcus is going to make sure the right people have what you photographed. This is going to move fast from here, and I need you both somewhere safe. While it does. Jake looked at me with the same direct attention he had been giving me since the kitchen doorway that morning. And you? He asked. I'm going to go have a conversation, I said. He nodded once, slowly. The nod of someone accepting an answer they don't entirely like, but recognize as the honest one. Then he turned back to the laptop. Sandra walked me to the door. She didn't say anything until I was on the porch steps, and then she said, Mr. Hadley. I turned. She was standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest. Not defensively, but in the way of someone bracing against something. Whatever he says in there, she said. Danny already wrote down what he saw. Nobody can change that now. No, I said. They can't. I drove downtown with the windows down despite the cold, because I needed the air, and because some decisions sit better with physical discomfort to keep them company. The building was on Commerce Street, 18 floors of glass and steel that caught the afternoon light and threw it back at the street below. Dean Whitfield's name was not on the building. It was on the directory in the lobby, Suite 1812. Whitfield Consulting, LLC. The name I had not known existed until this morning. I parked. I sat in the truck for 30 seconds. Not hesitating. Just noting where I was and what I was about to do and making sure I was the version of myself I wanted to be when I did it. Then I got out, walked through the lobby, and pressed the button for the 18th floor. Dean Whitfield's office told the story of a man who had arranged his life carefully and successfully for long enough that the arrangement had stopped feeling like effort. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Nashville spread below in the afternoon light like something offered. A desk that was clear and deliberate. A laptop. A legal pad. A pen that cost more than the pad. The kind of office that says everything is under control without using those words. Dean was standing when I walked in. Not sitting, which told me the time between the receptionist's call and my appearance had been used for something other than waiting comfortably. He had needed a moment. I understood that. I had needed several moments myself in the past 24 hours. He looked the way he always looked, which was one of the more difficult things about the morning. Silver hair. A suit that fit the way suits fit, when they know your measurements. The easy posture of someone whose daily life has not recently required him to sleep in a vehicle. He looked like Dean. He looked like my partner of 15 years. Like the man who had stood at the graveside in March 2 years ago, and driven me home, and washed dishes in my kitchen, until the last guest left. "Tom," he said. "What a surprise." I closed the door. I crossed the room. I set the yellow envelope on the desk between us, and sat down in the chair across from him, and said nothing. Dean looked at the envelope. Something moved behind his eyes, small and quickly controlled, but there. He picked it up. He opened it. He went through the contents methodically. The photograph first, then the document, then the folded email. Reading each, with an expression so managed, it was almost impressive. Almost. His jaw tightened somewhere in the middle pages of the document, and by the time he unfolded the email, the control was costing him visibly. He read the email, folded it, set it on the desk, looked at me. "Tom," he said again. "Don't," I said. He closed his mouth. The room held us both in silence. Outside the windows, the city went about its afternoon, unhurried and indifferent, and I sat across from a man I had trusted completely for 15 years and waited for him to be a person in a room with me one more time before everything else began. "I want to ask you one thing," I said. "Not about the business reason, not about the financial pressure. I know what the documents say. I want to know why you, specifically, made the choice you made. Because you had other options, Dean. You always had other options. You could have come to me. You could have told me you were in trouble again. You could have made 100 different decisions that didn't end with Danny Reeves going to work on a Tuesday morning and not coming home." I held his gaze. "So why didn't you?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone choosing words. It was the silence of someone looking directly at something they had been looking away from for a long time. "The debts were different this time," he said. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. The performance was gone entirely, and what remained underneath was smaller, like a room with the furniture removed. The people I owed were not the kind of people you discuss with Tom Hadley. And Harlan had been patient. 2 years, Tom. He was very patient and very specific. And I told myself at every step that it wouldn't go the way it went. He stopped. I kept telling myself that. "And Danny Reeves," I said. Dean looked down at the desk. "I told myself the section would fail on an off shift," he said. "That the floor would go when nobody was on it. A structural incident, not a—" He stopped. I did not fill in the word. Neither did he. We both knew what came at the end of that sentence, and neither of us was going to say it in this room. I stood up. I reached for the envelope. Dean looked up quickly, the first uncontrolled movement he had made since I sat down. He was expecting the next part. The part where I picked up the phone, or told him to call his lawyer, or informed him that agents were on their way. He was braced for the machinery of consequences to begin. And there was something in his expression that looked almost like relief at the prospect, the specific relief of a man who has been waiting for the thing he deserves and is tired of the waiting. I picked up the envelope and then I stopped. Because the door opened behind me. I had left it unlocked deliberately. Marcus came in quietly and stood to one side near the wall. And behind Marcus, Because Jake Reeves had made a different decision about staying in Fern Valley Road than the one I had asked him to make, came Jake. He was wearing the same gray sweatshirt he had been wearing at his mother's kitchen table. He stood just inside the doorway and looked at Dean Whitfield across the length of the office with the steady, undemanding attention of someone who has nothing left to perform and nowhere left to be except exactly where he is. Dean saw him, and all of it, every last remnant of the composure and the management and the professional distance that had carried Dean Whitfield through 15 years of rooms and decisions and the particular daily work of being the person he had chosen to be, came apart. Not loudly. There was no dramatic moment. It was quieter than that, and worse. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The set of his jaw changed. His eyes, which had been holding mine with the determined steadiness of someone maintaining eye contact because looking away would cost more, moved to Jake and stayed there. Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. He was 19 years old with his father's build and his father's careful attention to the things in front of him, and he stood in the doorway of an 18th floor office on a Wednesday afternoon and simply existed in Dean Whitfield's line of sight, which was the most devastating thing anyone in that room could have done. Dean looked at Jake for a long moment. Then he looked down at the desk and did not look up again. The room was very quiet. "Dean," I said. He didn't raise his head. "I'm going to give you one chance to make this right," I said. "One. And you're going to take it." I set the envelope back on the desk in front of him, because the alternative is that I walk out of here and let the process handle it. And the process does not care about context or intention or what you told yourself at each step. The process only cares about what the documents say. I paused. "And you've read what the documents say?" Dean's hands were flat on the desk. He was looking at them. "What do you want me to do?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat back down. "Sit with that question for a minute," I said. "Because the answer matters, and I need you to understand it before I tell you." The answer, when I told him, was not what Dean expected. I could see that clearly enough. Not the reaction of a man being handed something worse than he feared. The reaction of a man being handed something he hadn't considered at all, which in certain circumstances is more disorienting than worse. I told him I didn't want his money. Not a private settlement. Not a confidential arrangement. Not any of the instruments that men in his position reach for when they need problems to disappear quietly into folders that nobody opens again. I had spent enough of my life around construction contracts to know exactly how those arrangements worked and exactly what they were designed to protect, and it was not the people who needed protecting. What I wanted was this. I wanted Dean Whitfield to walk into a room with the Nashville Metro Council's Oversight Committee, voluntarily, with his own attorney present, and say what he had just said to me. Not a version of it. Not a managed account with the sharpest edges softened for a sympathetic audience. The truth, in the specific way that truth needs to be spoken when a man is dead and a family has spent a year and a half waiting for someone to stand up and say what actually happened. I wanted the civil settlement proceeds directed entirely to Sandra Reeves and to the families of every worker whose livelihood had been affected by the shutdown of Hadley Construction. Not a gesture toward that outcome. A full accounting. Documented and enforceable. Before any of this went further, and I needed it done before the end of the week. Marcus's federal contacts were moving on Victor Harlan, regardless of what Dean decided. The window in which Dean could be the man who came forward rather than the man who was brought forward was not large and was getting smaller. Dean listened without interrupting. His hands were flat on the desk. Jake had moved from the doorway to a chair against the wall and was sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. Present, but not pressing. The specific patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do. When I finished, Dean was quiet. "If I do this," he said, "I lose everything." "Yes," I said. "The firm. The reputation. Possibly my freedom, depending on how the federal piece develops." "Yes," I said again. He looked at me steadily. "And you're presenting this as the better option." "I'm presenting this as the only option that lets you be a person at the end of it, instead of just a defendant," I said. Those are different things. You know they're different things. He looked at Jake. Jake didn't look up, and Dean Whitfield, behind his carefully arranged desk in his carefully arranged office, looked at a 19-year-old kid in a gray sweatshirt who had come to this room for one reason only, and he made his decision. He nodded, small, unperformed. The nod of a man who has finished arguing with himself and arrived, late and at considerable cost, somewhere he should have arrived a long time ago. Marcus stepped forward from the wall. He set a business card on the desk beside the yellow envelope. "My federal contact," he said. "Call him before 5 today. Tell him you're coming in voluntarily. That conversation will go differently than the alternative." He paused. Considerably differently. Dean looked at the card. He picked it up. I stood. I looked at Dean one more time. This man I had built something with for 15 years. This man who had stood at Margaret's grave and washed dishes in my kitchen and said, "I will never forget this," and I tried to find something useful to say and found nothing. Some distances are too large for words to cross. You acknowledge them or you don't. And either way, the distance remains. "Dean," I said. He looked up. "Do right by Danny Reeves," I said. "That's all." I picked up the yellow envelope from the desk. I walked to the door. Jake rose from his chair without being asked and followed. Marcus came last, pulling the door closed behind him with the quiet click of someone who understands finality. The elevator was empty. The three of us rode down 18 floors without speaking. The lobby was busy with the ordinary midday traffic of a downtown office building, people moving with the purposeful indifference of people who had somewhere specific to be, and no knowledge of what had just happened on the floor above them. We walked out into the afternoon. Nashville was doing what Nashville does in November. Gray sky and cold air, and the particular smell of a city that has decided autumn is mostly over and is getting ready for something else. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building and breathed it in and felt, for the first time since the phone call from my lawyer 3 weeks ago that had started all of this, something that was not grief or anger or exhaustion. It was not happiness either. I want to be precise about that. It was quieter than happiness, and more durable. The specific settledness of a person who has done what they came to do and can now go home, except that I did not have a home yet, which was a problem I was going to have to address, but which suddenly felt like the kind of problem that had a solution rather than the kind that didn't. "What now?" Jake asked. He was standing beside me on the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of his gray sweatshirt, looking at the street. "Now we wait," Marcus said, "and we let the process do what the process does." Jake nodded slowly. Then he looked at me. "My mom's going to want to know how it went." "Tell her it went the way it needed to," I said. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded again. The same slow nod. The nod of someone accepting an answer they recognize as honest, even if it isn't complete. He turned and walked toward the parking structure. Marcos watched him go. "He's going to be okay," Marcus said quietly. "Yes," I said. "He is." Dean Whitfield appeared before the Nashville Metro Council's Oversight Committee on a Friday morning, 3 days after the conversation on the 18th floor. I was not in the room. I want to be clear about that. It was his room to be in, not mine, and I had said everything I needed to say on a Wednesday afternoon, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of a city that had not yet finished deciding what it thought of all of us. Whatever happened in that room on Friday morning was Dean's to carry. The weight of it, the words of it, the particular quality of silence that follows when a person says true things in a room full of people who have been waiting a long time to hear them. Marcus was there, as a witness, as a practical matter, and because 31 years of federal work had given him a specific appreciation for being present when important things are said officially for the first time. He texted me at 9:47 that morning. 2 words. "He's talking." That was all I needed to know. Sandra was there. She had dressed carefully, the way people dress carefully when they are going somewhere that matters. Dark jacket, hair down, the composed and steady presence of a woman who had spent a year and a half being told that what she knew was not provable and had spent every day of that time proving them wrong anyway. She sat in the second row with Jake beside her, and she did not look away from the front of the room once, according to what she told me later, and I believed her completely. Jake sat straight in a dark jacket that Sandra told me he had bought specifically for the occasion, which told me something about how seriously he had decided to take this moment, which told me something about the kind of man he was becoming. He had his father's attention to the things in front of him. He was going to do something good with it. I was already certain of that. Dean told the truth. All of it, in the flat, specific way of someone who has made a decision and is committed to the fullness of it, rather than a careful, partial version. He described the meetings with Victor Harlan. He described the contract, the one Jake had photographed in a gray truck in an industrial lot on a Wednesday morning, while a black sedan moved slowly at the end of the street. He described the access to the Route 9 structural drawings and how that access had been used. He described the gray truck and the men in it, and what they had been sent to do, and when, and how. He did not use phrases like potential collateral impact. He used Danny Reeves's name. He said it clearly, in a room full of people, and the room was very quiet when he did. I heard about all of this secondhand, from Marcus and from Sandra separately, on Friday afternoon. They told it differently. The way two people who were in the same room always tell the same event differently, each from the angle of what mattered most to them. Marcus told it precisely, and in sequence, the way he did everything. Sandra told it once, quietly, and then was silent for a moment on the phone. And in that silence, I understood everything she didn't say. Victor Harlan's offices received their federal visitors the same afternoon. Dean finished speaking to the Metro Council. Marcus had arranged the timing deliberately, I suspected, with the specific satisfaction of a man who understood that the sequence of things matters as much as the things themselves. Harlan's attorneys were apparently already mobilizing before the agents reached the elevator bank, which meant Harlan had known something was coming, which did not matter because knowing something is coming and being prepared to stop it are entirely different categories of problem, and Harlan had confused them. The Metro Council suspended Harlan Development Group's operating permits pending investigation before the end of the business day. 3 of the 4 contracts that had migrated from Hadley Construction to Harlan in the months following Route 9 were frozen pending review. The Nashville Business Journal published a story online that evening and a longer piece the following Tuesday, which felt appropriate given the day of the week and everything associated with it. The formal Metro Council findings were released the following Thursday. I read them in my truck in a parking garage on 2nd Avenue, sitting in the same seat where I had reclined and pulled a jacket over my chest 6 weeks earlier, outside a house with green shutters in Franklin, Tennessee. The findings named Hadley Construction explicitly, victim of a coordinated effort to cause reputational and financial damage through the deliberate engineering of a workplace safety incident. I read those words 3 times. Victim of a coordinated effort. The language of official documents, careful and specific, and entirely without warmth, which is what makes it credible and what makes it land the way it lands. I sat with those words in the parking garage and felt the weight of them settle into something I had been carrying without knowing exactly what shape it was. Not vindication. That is not quite the right word for what it felt like. Vindication implies that the primary concern was being believed, and my primary concern had never been being believed. My primary concern had been Danny Reeves and his notebook and the question he had written on a Tuesday and intended to ask on a Wednesday. What it felt like was closer to completion. The closing of something that had been open too long. The specific quiet that arrives when a story finds its proper ending. Not a happy ending necessarily. Not everything restored to what it was, but a true one, an honest one. The kind that acknowledges the cost of things while refusing to be defined entirely by it. My phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. 4 words. Jake got in. Vanderbilt. I read it twice. Then I sat back in my seat and looked at the ceiling of the truck cab. At the small scuff mark near the dome light that I had first noticed 6 weeks ago, on a night I had thought was the end of something, and I smiled. Not the unhinged laugh from outside Connor's house, not the tight, controlled expression I had been wearing for most of the past 3 weeks. A real smile, small and private, and entirely my own. Danny Reeves's son was going to build things. The office on 2nd Avenue was available because the previous tenant, a small architectural firm, had moved to a larger space downtown after landing a municipal contract. I know this because the landlord told me when I signed the lease, the way landlords sometimes tell you the history of a space as though it might make you feel better about occupying it. It did, actually. An architectural firm moving to something bigger felt like the right kind of predecessor for what I had in mind. 7th floor. 1 room and a small attached space I was using for storage. A window that looked north toward the Cumberland River, which on clear days you could see moving between the buildings, gray-green and steady, and entirely unbothered by anything happening on its banks. The rent was manageable on the consulting income I had begun to generate in the 2 weeks since the Metro Council findings had been published, and Hadley Construction's name had stopped being associated with negligence and started being associated with something else entirely. I had bought a second-hand desk from a place on Nolansville Pike. A chair. A coffee maker. The basic kind. The kind that does one thing, and does it without drama. I had put Margaret's photograph on the desk rather than the dashboard, which felt like the right transition. She was still laughing at the thing I had said at the Grand Ole Opry in 1998. I still could not remember what it was. I had decided to stop trying to remember and simply be grateful that the moment had been worth photographing. Marcus came by on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the Friday hearing. He knocked twice, which was fewer than the 3 knocks on the truck window that had started all of this, and I noted that with the quiet amusement of someone who has started paying attention to the small symmetries that accumulate in a life if you are willing to look for them. He came in and sat in the only other chair in the room, and looked around at the space with the evaluating attention of a man who has spent a career assessing environments. Small, he said. Intentionally, I said. He accepted that without comment, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about Marcus. He accepted a great many things without comment that other people would have pressed on. He had news, though he delivered it in the manner of someone for whom news is simply information rather than drama. The federal case against Victor Harlan was moving forward. A plea agreement was being discussed, which Marcus described as likely given the quality of the documentary evidence, which was his way of saying that Jake's photographs in an industrial lot on a Wednesday morning had done exactly what they needed to do. Dean's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the spring. Marcus did not speculate about outcomes. He reported what was known and left the rest where it belonged, which was in the future, where speculation lives and certainty has not yet arrived. And you? I asked when he had finished. Me, he said. He looked at the river through my window for a moment. I've been doing this work for 31 years. Contract work. Since I retired. One case at a time. For people who couldn't get the answers they needed through the regular channels. He paused. Sandra Reeves came to me because nobody else was asking the right questions. That happens more often than it should. Are you going to keep doing it? For a while, he said. He stood up, which with Marcus was always a precise and economical movement. Nothing wasted. Tom. He looked at me directly. You did the right thing in that office. Not the easy thing. The right thing. Those are not always the same, and it matters that you knew the difference. He held out his hand. I shook it. He left without further ceremony, which was entirely consistent with everything I knew about him. And I watched him go and thought that the world was better arranged than it sometimes appeared, that it produced, occasionally and when needed, people like Marcus Webb, and that this was worth noting. I called Sandra that afternoon. She sounded different from the woman who had opened the door on Fern Valley Road 3 weeks earlier. Not happier exactly, because happiness was not the right category for where she was. More settled. The way a person sounds when they have put something down that they have been carrying for a long time, and their body is still adjusting to the difference in weight. Jake had started orientation at Vanderbilt the previous week, she told me. He had gone to the engineering school's open house and come home afterward and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying anything, which she had learned to recognize as Jake processing something rather than Jake struggling with something. The difference between those two things, she said, was one of the finer distinctions of raising that particular person. He had left Danny's notebook on the kitchen table before he drove to campus. Not put away. Not displayed. Just left there. Open to the last entry. The way you leave something in a room when you want it to be present without being the only thing in the room. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. About the way certain objects carry certain people forward. About the blue notebook with the bent wire spiral sitting open on a kitchen table in East Nashville, doing whatever notebooks do when the people who needed them most have moved on to the next thing. I thought about what I was building next. Not Hadley Construction. That name belonged to a chapter that had closed, and I had spent enough years in construction to know that you do not pour new foundation over old without accounting for what is underneath. Something new. Something that carried what I had learned, without being defined by how I had learned it. I had 3 consulting inquiries sitting in my email. 2 from firms I knew. 1 from a name I didn't recognize, which turned out, when I looked into it, to be a small contractor in Murfreesboro who had read the Business Journal story and decided that a man who had been through what I had been through and had come out the other side, with his reputation intact and his judgment demonstrably sound, was exactly the kind of person he wanted to talk to. I wrote back to all 3 of them. Outside my window, the river moved north, steady and unhurried, carrying whatever it carried toward wherever it was going. I watched it for a moment, before turning back to my desk. Margaret was laughing on the dashboard. The coffee maker was doing its one thing without drama. The second chair sat empty across from mine, which was fine. There was work to do. Connor called on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the night in Franklin. I was at my desk on the 7th floor when the phone rang. Outside the window, the river was doing what rivers do in November. Moving gray and purposeful between the buildings, carrying its particular indifference toward the Gulf. I had been reading through a set of structural specifications for the Murfreesboro contractor, the kind of careful, technical reading that I had always found settling, the way some people find music settling or walking settling. There is something about the precision of good engineering drawings that I had loved since the first time I held a set, 22 years old, and working for a contractor in Clarksville who had hired me because I was willing to start early and stay late, and had not yet learned to pretend I knew more than I did. I looked at the phone when it rang. Connor's name on the screen. I sat with it for 2 full rings. Not because I was deciding whether to answer, but because some calls deserve a moment of acknowledgement before you pick them up. A beat of recognition that what is about to happen matters. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad," Connor said. His voice was different. Not the voice from the porch in Franklin 6 weeks ago. That careful, lowered voice of a man managing a situation he had not prepared for and did not want to be in. This was smaller, more exposed. The voice of someone who has spent 6 weeks sitting with something uncomfortable and has stopped trying to make it comfortable and has arrived, on the other side of that effort, at something that sounds like honesty. "Connor," I said. A pause. The kind that means the person on the other end has prepared something and is now deciding whether the prepared version is the right one. "I saw the council findings," he said, "and the journal stories. I've been following all of it." Another pause. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I did, what I didn't do, when you came to the house." His voice tightened slightly. The way voices tighten when a person is being precise about something they would prefer to be vague about. "I've been thinking about it every single day." "I know," I said. "I want to explain. There were things going on with Rebecca, and the situation felt complicated, and I was." He stopped. Started again. "No, I'm not going to do that. There's no explanation that makes what I did okay. I closed the door in your face when you had nowhere to go. And I have been living inside that fact for 6 weeks. And I needed you to know that I know exactly what I did." I was quiet for a moment. The river moved outside the window. A tugboat was making its way upstream, slow and committed, pushing against the current with the patient determination of something that has decided where it is going and is not interested in reconsidering. "Connor," I said, "I love you. You are my son. Those two things are not conditional, and they are not going away regardless of what has happened or what happens next." "Dad, let me finish," I said, not harshly. The way you say "let me finish" when you need the space to say something that matters and you need the other person to hold still for it. What you did hurt me. Not the practical part of it. Not the couch I didn't get to sleep on. The way you did it, the step through the door, the lowered voice, the careful management of a situation that was your father standing on a porch with nowhere to go. I paused. That told me something about who you had become that I hadn't seen clearly before. And I need you to sit with that a while longer before we talk about moving past it. The silence on the other end was the silence of someone listening, not waiting to respond, actually listening, which is a different thing and rarer than people think. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I am asking you to do the real work. Not the work that ends with a phone call and a clean resolution. The work that produces a person who understands what they're capable of and makes different choices going forward. That work takes longer than 6 weeks. And I think you know that." A long pause. Longer than I expected. Long enough that I knew he was actually considering it, rather than preparing the next thing to say, which was itself a different version of Connor than the one who had stepped through a door 6 weeks ago. "Yeah," he said finally. His voice had the quality of something beginning rather than something ending. "Yeah, I can do that." "Good," I said. "Dad." A pause. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "I know you are," I said. "I'll call you at Christmas." I hung up. I sat at my desk and looked at the river for a long time after that. The tugboat had made its way further upstream. Smaller now. Still pushing. I thought about Connor at 6 years old on a Little League field in the summer. The particular concentrated attention he gave to things he cared about, the way he stood at the plate, with his whole body committed to the next pitch. I thought about where that person had gone, and whether 6 weeks of sitting with something uncomfortable was enough to start finding his way back to it. I thought it might be. I was not certain, but I thought it might be. And that was enough to work with. I thought about Margaret, who had known Connor in all of his versions and had loved him through all of them with the specific patient love of a mother who understands that people are not fixed points, who understood that the distance between who someone is and who they could be is not a verdict but an invitation. I thought about a night 6 weeks ago when I had pulled a jacket over my chest in a truck cab and looked at the ceiling and believed, with the complete conviction of a man who had run out of alternatives, that I had arrived at the end of something. I had been wrong. I had been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they mistake the lowest point of a story for its conclusion. When they stand at the bottom of something and look around and see only bottom and forget that bottom is also floor. That floor is also foundation. That foundation is also the thing you build on. I know that now. I know it the way you know things that have been taught to you by your own life rather than by someone else's words, which is the only kind of knowing that stays. Outside the window, Nashville moved in its ordinary urgent way, full of people carrying their Thursdays with them toward whatever came next. I turned back to my desk. Margaret was laughing on the photograph. The structural specifications were still open in front of me. There was work to do, and for the first time in a very long time, I was looking forward to it. I want to tell you something about the night I slept in that truck. Not the practical details. You know those already. The reclined seat, the jacket blanket, the scuff mark on the ceiling, the photograph on the dashboard. You know about the door that closed in Franklin and the sprinkler system that came on somewhere down the street and the dark sedan sitting 2 houses away with its engine running. You know all of that. What I want to tell you is something different. Something I didn't understand until much later, until I was sitting on the 7th floor of a building on 2nd Avenue with a river view and a second-hand desk, and 3 consulting contracts and a phone call from my son that had not gone perfectly but had gone honestly, which is better than perfectly in the ways that matter. What I want to tell you is that the night in the truck was not the worst night of my life. I know how that sounds. I know what it looked like from the outside. A 62-year-old man with a bad knee and no company, and no house, sleeping under a jacket in a vehicle in front of a door that had just been closed in his face. I know that if you had driven past that truck on that street on that particular Tuesday night and looked in the window, you would have seen something that looked like the end of a story. The last frame before the credits. The point past which there is nothing, but you would have been wrong. And I was wrong too. Lying there looking at the ceiling, thinking that I had arrived at the conclusion of something. Because the thing about rock bottom, the thing that nobody tells you until you have been there and come back, is that it has a floor. It is cold and it is hard and it is nothing like the life you built and lost, but it is solid. It holds. And solid ground, however uncomfortable, is something you can stand on, something you can push off from, something you can build on top of. If you are willing to do the work and patient enough to do it slowly and honest enough to build something true rather than something fast. I have spent 62 years building things, schools and community centers and mixed-use developments, and one company that took 19 years to become what it became, and 3 weeks to fall apart. I have built things with my hands and my judgment and the specific knowledge that comes from standing on enough job sites that your body starts to know the difference between a structure that will hold and a structure that is pretending. I have built a marriage that lasted 31 years and produced one son who is still in the process of deciding what kind of person he is going to be. Which is true of most of us if we are being honest about it. And I have learned at 62, sleeping under a jacket in a truck in November, something that I suspect I could not have learned any other way. That the most important thing you build in a life is not a company or a house or a reputation. It is the floor underneath you. The thing that holds when everything else is gone. The thing that was there all along, built out of the 1,000 small decisions you made over decades to be a particular kind of person, decisions so ordinary and unremarkable that you never thought of them as construction at all. I think about Danny Reeves. I think about him often. More than people might expect, given that we never met, given that he was a name on a crew manifest and a voice I never heard, and a face I know only from a photograph on a wall in a house on Fern Valley Road. I think about his $2 notebook and his small, precise handwriting and the care he brought to the work of paying attention. I think about the question he wrote to himself on a Tuesday. Should I say something? And I think about the fact that he was going to, that he had decided, that he had gotten to the page where he wrote, "I'll tell him tomorrow," and had meant it completely and had simply run out of tomorrows before he could. That is not a tragedy I can fix. I want to be clear about that. The way I try to be clear about things that cannot be changed. I cannot give Danny Reeves his tomorrows back. I cannot undo the morning on Route 9 or the 14 months of a family without its center, or the 19 years of a son growing up without his father's particular brand of careful attention to the things in front of him. Those costs are real, and they are permanent, and no amount of justice, however thorough, changes that arithmetic. What I can do, what I am trying to do, is build something that honors the floor that held me, that honors the people who helped me find it. Marcus, who knocked on a truck window at 7 in the morning, with the patience of a man who already knew how the day was going to go. Sandra, who kept asking the right questions long after the reasonable thing to do was stop asking. Jake, who stood in a kitchen doorway in a gray sweatshirt and said the true thing rather than the easy one, and who is going to build things because his father built things, and because the apple, as it turns out, does not fall as far from the tree as grief sometimes makes it appear. And God, who has a way of arranging floors under people who have run out of floor, who put a man in a truck on a Tuesday night and let him sleep, and put another man outside that truck at 7 in the morning with 3 knocks and a reason to get up, and who has been, in my experience, considerably more present in the wreckage than in the comfort. It is a thing I have observed about difficulty. It clarifies. It removes the unnecessary. It leaves you with what you actually are rather than what you have arranged yourself to appear to be. And what you actually are, it turns out, is often more than you thought. More durable. More capable of standing up from a reclined truck seat on a cold Wednesday morning and driving toward whatever comes next. I know who I am now. It took 62 years and a collapsed business and a foreclosed house and one deeply uncomfortable truck seat and a Wednesday morning that I did not see coming to get here. But I know. And if you have made it this far, if this story found you at the right moment, if it sat with you the way I hope it did, then I suspect you might know something about floors too, about the cold, solid ground that holds you when everything else has gone, about the particular grace of being still standing when the thing you thought would break you turns out to be, in the end, the thing that showed you what you were made of. If someone in your life needs to hear that today, share this with them. It costs you nothing and it might mean everything to them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories coming. Stories about people who found the floor and pushed off from it. Stories worth staying for. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. Thank you for listening.